Please welcome Nicholas Lang, Managing Director, Senior Partner, and Global Leader in the BCG Global Advantage Practice for a discussion on the interplay between economics and global security.
Nikki, I hope you enjoyed. I had fun. I'm having fun up here. Everybody still having fun? Hello, C-SPAN. Great to see you. I'm Steve Clemens of Semafor. If you haven't, had it beaten into your head, but I think we're having a fascinating set of conversations today. I'm having an editorial conversation with you. You are the sponsor of today, and we want to thank you for that. But that's enough. Thank you for that. I want to get serious about, the broad side of thinking about the overlay of security. I mean, I was taught in my econ classes that economics exists outside of the silo of security, and that when you begin, merging them together, the inefficiency you create, it takes you down kind of command and control path, inefficient outcomes. So let me ask you, what is this, from your perspective, what's happening with global trade and economic flows because of the geopolitical stress in the world?
Yeah. So I think first, Steve, thank you for having me.
My pleasure.
And I think it's a great event. We started yesterday evening, this morning.
We're totally nerding out today.
But I think when we talk about the economic environment, I think most of the business leaders we have seen have been working for 30, 40, 50, 60 years in a world where free trade was the kind of general paradigm. Yeah. And so I'd like to quote two sentences. Yeah. Bretton Woods is like 70 years ago. So we had 70 years of a global trade system that was largely free trade oriented. And we had 35 years of what Prime Minister Morawiecki called geopolitical napping. Yeah, because
geopolitical napping.
Napping, siesta.
Like siesta,
in Italy.
Sleep at the wheel.
So starting in the early 1990s, we said it's the end of history and the world is flat. And so I think large groups of business leaders were used to work in an environment that was kind of focused on free trade and didn't have a lot of geopolitical tensions. Now, when you look at what has happened over the last 5 years, we've had a massive rise in tariffs, we've had a pandemic, and we have a war. And so the future of global trade will look completely different. And as we agreed, I brought one slide with me.
I want to see this slide. I want to show the world this slide.
A data set. So I don't know if the team can bring up the slide. But it is actually about the future of trade. And when we look at what is happening over the next, let's say, 10 years, we are seeing a massive change of trade. So if you have forgotten everything I will tell you now in the next 10 minutes, I'd like to invite you to just remember 3 numbers. It's 100, 300, and 1,000.
Okay. Yeah?
So these 3 numbers, if you've forgotten everything
there are a lot more numbers up here.
Yeah, but that's why
I wanted to put it up here because I thought it was really pretty. But I know it tells a story, so sorry to get in your way.
Yeah, no worries. That's good. It's good. So I know there are a lot of numbers here, and we're very happy to share this. We actually published this, but I'd like to focus on 3 numbers: the 100, the 300, and the 1,000. So what you see here is the map of trade in 2031. So 8 years from now, how will trade evolve? The positive thing is that the underlying perspective is that actually global trade will continue to grow by 2.3%. So those people who tell me...
Annually,
yeah. So those people who tell me it's the end of globalization, the end of global trade and stuff like this, this is just wrong. We will continue to see growth of trade at 2.3% per annum. Now, what is interesting is what is actually shifting in the corridors, and that's where you see the green and the red and the yellow lines. So I'd like first to start with what I call the 100, and actually it's not exactly 100, it's more like the 63 billion, but it is the one relationship that this city is always focusing on, which is US-China. So if you look at the map, there is a tiny red arrow between US and China, 63 billion. So yes, trade between US and China will go down by 63 or 80 billion in the next 10 years. But the interesting point is that at global trade, these 100 billion are actually not the decisive change that will happen. The much bigger decisive change is what I said, the 300. And the 300 appears twice. Look at the biggest red arrow on this map, which is, no surprise, the arrow between Russia and EU.
Let's do that. That's this one, right?
That's this one, exactly.
Okay.
And this arrow is because we are not getting any gas, oil, and coal anymore from Russia. And actually, I'm based in Munich.
Right.
So we spent the winter this year with Norwegian gas, with American LNG, with Algerian gas. So the trade goes down by almost 300 billion between Russia and EU. And at the same time, look at what happens in the North Atlantic. The trade goes up by 300 billion between the US,
right?
Exactly, between US and Europe. So you could say simply that the Europeans are replacing Russian pipeline gas by American LNG. The world is not as simple as that, but 80% right. So we see a massive change in the energy infrastructure in Europe, which is my second number, the 300 billion. Now the third one, which is interesting, is what you see around here in Southeast Asia happening. And that was my third number, the 1,000. 1,000 billion additional, or 1 trillion additional trade coming out of Southeast Asia, coming into Southeast Asia. And why is that happening? Because a lot of companies found out that betting everything on China might be a little bit risky. And many of the companies have a so-called China plus one strategy, which is building computers in Vietnam, building electric vehicle batteries in Indonesia, setting up data centers in India. So just as a summary, 100 is the much discussed US-China tension. 3 times more relevant, or not more relevant, but bigger, is the Russia-EU and US-EU shift on energy. And 10 times more important is the rise of Southeast Asia and ASEAN. That's what I would say as a simplification of this complex
The other thing, some things that stand out to me here are Africa.
Yeah.
Africa, you've got 73 billion, 137 billion here. I assume that these are still huge growth numbers given Africa's base today.
Yes.
Is that right? Is Africa coming on? When you think about the future of the global middle class, the net adds to the global middle class are not coming from Europe and the United States, right? We're largely stagnant if you look at growth.
Yes.
Where's the global middle class growing? I mean, is it Africa? Is it ASEAN? Is it India? And how would that affect this map?
Yeah, I think global middle class will be massively growing in Africa. I think this is clear. Africa are 52 countries with the youngest population in the world. We have, and just while you're talking about Africa, I think there are 2 interesting numbers. Look the relationship between Africa and China, 73 billion. This is the One Belt, One Road initiative we discussed yesterday. Yeah, the increasing influence of China on Africa. Up to 10 years ago, Europe was the biggest foreign direct investor in Africa. Now it's China, so that's what you see here. The relationship between Africa and Europe is driven by 2 things. One is metals and minerals, and the second one is nearshoring. Do you know that a famous Spanish fashion retailer used to produce his fashion in Bangladesh and is now doing it in Morocco? Wiring harnesses are coming from Tunisia. So what we see in North America with Mexico, where you see a very nice picture of 200 billion between Mexico and US, is actually also driving Africa.
Nikki, you're based in Munich, right?
Yes.
You're based in Munich, and you kind of operate with the world. I'm interested in some issues. So this is a look into the future of the way you see things going on. Is this based upon America just being in status quo policy? Then does it have to get anything right? Can it screw up this picture? Can Europe kick down its own hill? I mean, what would disrupt this picture by way of policy choices that either the U.S. or let's just say Germany? I mean, I've been intrigued with the fact that Germany is getting all this credit for coming in with liquefied natural gas, building that infrastructure, et cetera, when it gave up its nuclear industry, which I look at as sort of creating a strategic choice for its allies, right? But if you kind of look at policy choices that are out there that could be disruptive, what are some that worry you?
Well, I think, again, what we see as a potential scenario which is kind of behind this logic is that we will continue to see some kind of conflict in Ukraine. Yeah, I think
this presumes conflict.
This presumes a stalemate for a few years to come. I think this is, unfortunately, I think the reality we are facing. But it does not presume a big conflict in the Indo-Pacific. Let's put it like this. Yeah.
What if Russia wins?
Well, I'm not a military strategist, but what we have seen over the last 12 months is that this is unlikely in the foreseeable future. Let's put it like that.
And another arena that I miss in the kind of, the broad U.S.-China competition, rivalry, nobody wants to say we're on a collision course, but let's presume we are on a collision course. What happens to the world economy, as you sort of look at technology? You're just talking about EV stuff. I mean, someone just made very clear to me that if China wanted to shut down the U.S. EV industry, it could do it tomorrow if it withheld certain products. I mean, do you worry that there are heads in the sand when it comes to understanding how globally interconnected we fundamentally are, and that ripping that apart could be disastrous?
Yeah. Well, I think many people know that ripping apart global economy is disastrous. Let me just give you one figure. Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus together are 2.3% of global trade. China is 15.9% of global trade. And if you look at the disruption that these 2.3% of global trade have generated, because we have a disruption of three major value chains, which is energy, agri-food, and metals, I don't want to imagine what happens if we are kind of having a conflict with a player that covers 15.9% of global trade.
And then finally, I would just love to hear and get a map, again, of what I was talking to Larry Culp about, and Brad Smith. As you look at the turbulence in the world, you look at the stress, not geopolitical stress, but because of COVID, we had a overheating of some economies to keep them going. That then put a lot of cash in people's hand, chasing a fixed number of products. Inflation went wild. A lot of people changed their lifestyle. A lot of labor force in the United States disappeared. I'm interested less in the micro decisions of what a company does, as opposed to how a chief executive officer manages to shift and approach it. This is one of the expertise of BCG. What sorts of insights can you give us about the framing of decision making in these times? And is it fundamentally different than before COVID, before the Ukraine war? How has it changed?
Yeah. Look, I think in the last year, I've spoken to about 230 boards and CEOs and C-suite. And I think what you see is that we are shifting from what we used to do in the past, which was like planning with one reality, with one perspective of the future, to a multidimensional reality. So one of the things we're doing most with our clients is actually scenario planning. Yeah. So if you are a big metals player exporting to China, well, you need to look at, is there a conflict around Taiwan or not? Because that will impact 50% of my top line. If I'm a big car manufacturer selling 42% of my sales to China, I need to take that into account. So I think what we see in the way how decision-making has changed is that in the past you had this one perfect plan, potentially 10 years ahead, where people realized in the last 5 years that they had three major exogenous shocks that made these plans completely void. And that's why I think we see more and more.
So how many CEOs are good at that? I mean, CEOs make an insane amount of money compared to other folks. I mean, the executive pay is enormous, but that was for a different set of terms and a different chessboard. If they're playing multidimensional, do you expect to see a shakeout of CEOs that can handle that and CEOs that can't?
Well, I think it's definitely a new reality. I think many CEOs face this new reality of geopolitical tension, of labor shortage, of inflationary environment. And I think that's something where a big change will happen in the way how corporate decision-making is done. But if I may just come back to on one point, because we kind of didn't touch this. You mentioned my home region, Europe. So just to make it clear, I'm from Austria, a very nice country, but politically a lightweight. So I can criticize Germans and French and others. But I think Europe is actually also at a big crossroads when you look at it in our relationship with the US, and also our relationship with China. And I like the sentence that Ursula von der Leyen said, the head of the EU Commission. She said, Europe, over the last 20 years, outsourced defense to the US, energy to Russia, and growth to China. So if you outsource your 3 key parameters to 3 political powers, it shows the big task ahead to bring that together.
Just to make a little news here, just as we close, and this will be the close, President Emmanuel Macron met with Xi Jinping and said, you know, not everything in the alliance is aligned. You know, our views on Taiwan may differ in Europe than the United States. He basically put some crevices and cracks in the alliance, in my view. And I'm wondering, you know, when it comes to things like strategic autonomy and Europe's sense of self and place and purpose in the world, does America need to be a little bit less presumptuous that Europe is going to be with it on everything?
Well, on one side, I think what Emmanuel Macron did in Beijing has kind of led to a big storm in Europe. Yeah, and I think.
Oh, I haven't read that.
Yeah. When he came back, the headlines were like Macron isolated in Europe, Berlin. Well, you have this German-French couple that's running Europe to a certain extent. So I think they have a little relationship crisis as we speak. So I think that's definitely something that will not. My view is, it's a bit of a positioning of France versus the rest of Europe. I don't think that this will be the primary political dimension of the EU going forward, because I think we are still a community of values between the US and EU. In some cases, maybe we should try to do that on a more equal footing than in the past. But I think the basic paradigms are still in the right place.
Oh, great. Well, I love the graphic. Did you like the graphic? It was so pretty when I saw it. I wanted to get it up there. Nikolaus Lang, Managing Director and Senior Partner, Global Leader of the Global Advantage Process of Boston Consulting Group. Thank you so much for joining.
Pleasure.
Thank you. Great to see you. Come back.